joined by Mike Marshall, who is a key professor and worked primarily with the 600 studio this semester. And he has joined us this afternoon after a major interview this morning. And of course, we have the professor of record here, the chair of Tim's project. And he's going to take us to a site outside the United States, in Toronto, where there's some landfill, an industrial area, and an old container area out toward Toronto, and he's going to be doing a film institute as well as filmmaking place. Take us to Toronto.
Great. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? 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 Is that better? Okay, great. All right, so I want to start off first by thanking my committee, Professor Abrams, as well as Professor Dupuy and Professor Kaligi, for helping me out through this rigorous process. It's been a great run, and I'm excited to present this to you, as well as my friends and my family who are out in the audience. I'm happy you could be here, as well as everyone else who I may not know as well for being here. So this is Framing Industry, Filmmaking to Placemaking. This is a thesis that looks at the relationship between filmmaking and placemaking. More specifically, the cinematic techniques within film and how they can actually be translated into architecture. This thesis proposes a film institute that enhances the post-industrial redevelopment, as well as creates a new mixed-use hub for the city of Toronto. Okay. So I'm going to take you through a couple different topics, and I'm going to start out with some of the initial research I went into when looking into the film in place, and then talking about the post-industrial redevelopment that has to do with the site, and then going into some precedent case studies that have similar program to this thesis as well. And then actually going into the Film Institute proposal to show you a little bit about the building and how it works and everything that's going on in it. As well as ending with a film that I put together that shows and represents this in a cinematic fashion, and hopefully you enjoy that as well. So the initial research in film, looking into film in place, led me to these various qualities that relate to both film and place. And I was able to categorize them into two different categories. One being the story-based category, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about these in the next couple slides. But the story-based ones are really about a sequence of events and how actually people interpret the sequence of events. And then there's the sensory-based qualities. It's really about the physical form of these spaces and how they can start to interact with your emotions and various aspects like that. So I'll go into these a little bit more detail. And for these next couple slides, I'm going to go through the qualities again, and I'll give you examples both in film and place that start to relate these together. So looking at the quality, the story-based qualities, the narrative quality specifically, really it talks about this idea of a sequence of events, which relates to, for a film like The Passenger or a place, the Berlin Jewish Museum, where it's really about this sequence of events that you go through that tells a compelling story. And then the spectator quality is really about, the spectator and how they start to interpret that sequence of events. So for instance, in the film Rear Window, there's a narrative that's told. However, the film is set up in a way that you're able to interpret the plot and what you're able to see. So one person's view might be different from another person's view if you're making assumptions based on the plot. And that can be related to the Swiss Expo Pavilion by Peter Zumthor. You can see how in this scenario, as a spectator, can actually start to enter into this space in different areas, and there's actually different events or activities within it to give each person who comes into the space a different experience. And then there's the optical quality. So this is the start of the sensory-based qualities. This one really talks about the frame and how framing spaces, the size of frames, or what's being framed, and how it relates to the spaces that can be created. So the first one here for the optical is this idea of immensity versus intimacy. So the size of the space being, really influencing the emotions within the space. So for instance, in a film like The Shining, you can see how there's very big abandoned spaces as well as intimate spaces, and how that can start to create emotion, and in this case, fear in The Shining. And you can see how this starts to relate in the framing of these spaces in various, like the Grundtvig Church in Copenhagen, Denmark, how this idea can start to create very powerful spaces. And then the next part of the optical quality is this idea of confinement or vastness, which is really about being inside or being within a confined area, as well as the awareness of the outside. So in Rope, this whole film was actually shot within the one apartment set, and there were only 2 times during the film that there was an awareness of the outside world, and there's an interesting thing that plays with the emotions, being confined into a space and then having that awareness of the outside, which can be seen in something like the Casa de Musica, whereas you're inside this confined area in this music hall. However, there's opportunities for the glazing to actually open out into the city and open out into the landscape to get you views out of the confined space. Then there's the temporal quality, which the temporal quality is really about time, the change of time, or the awareness of time. And this can be related to 2 different aspects. It could be related to light and shadow. So in like Nostalgia, the film Nostalgia, or the place Church of Light by Tadao Ando, you can see how at various, they play with light and shadow in unique ways, both in the film as well as the Church of Light, and how at different times of day, the light might start to affect the spaces that are being used. And then the second part of this is, talks about life. So in a film like Boyhood, this film was actually filmed over the course of 10 years. And the kid who's the actor in the beginning of the film is the same actor who played the same character, and it was the same actor when he went to go to college. So you can actually see the relationship to time while you watch that film. As well as life relating to vegetation. Can be like the MFO Park in Zurich, how vegetation can start to show you how the seasons and time changes throughout the year as well. So these ideas, these 4 qualities, are meant to be applied or used in various different spatial scenarios or designs. It's meant to be timeless or placeless. It's meant to be applied to any types of design aspects to get these cinematic qualities within design. So this is a diagram that actually takes all 4 of those qualities and puts them into one diagram to see how these can start to be translated into space. And then I was able to create this physical model where you can see pictures on the bottom there, as well as I have it hung up, to take these ideas and actually start to make it into a physical form. So you'll see how this is actually a series of frames, and there's a sequence. However, the red rope that's in here represents the spectators, the people within the spaces who are able to make a choice or a decision as you're continuing through the spaces. So where do we test these ideas? So we came upon a Toronto, which ended up being just such a perfect fit for this site, and I'll tell you why. And we're specifically focused on the Portlands area, which is this industrial, post-industrial district of Toronto. And you'll notice how it's actually like the same, it's almost bigger than actual downtown Toronto itself, which is pretty interesting. And it's actually at the joint between the urban center and the more natural side of the Portlands on the east side of Toronto on Lake Ontario. And this site includes a ship channel that actually comes through here where ships were able to turn around and come back through to drop off things or pick up things relating to the industry. So let's take a look at the site a little bit closer. What's interesting about this site is you can see how there's actually a lot of vacant areas. So it's a post-industrial site, like I said, and however, the black buildings you see here are actually the existing buildings that are there that are related to industry and various other things. But what's interesting is the red is actually representing film studios that are actually within the area. So there's a really strong emphasis on film. They actually call this area the studio district. And this one right here is actually the biggest one in the area, which is the Pinewood Toronto Film Studio. And and right across here, which is where the proposed site is the Hearn Generating Station, which is a out of commission power generating station that you can see on the boards here, as well as there's an image right here of what that looks like. And fortunately, this site there's actually a city plan for this site to be developed in the next like 40 to 50 years along here in this area, creating these various different districts, as well as the river is getting rerouted to deal with a lot of the flooding issues that are going to be an issue down the line for this area as well. And then the Hearn Generating Station, let me talk about this first. So the idea for the site is, I talked about the natural area being over here. So this thesis looks to extend the urban fabric from the more urban part through this industry zone to connect over to the more natural areas of the site. And that starts to introduce opportunities for the Toronto's famous streetcar network to actually start to be connected into this area. Because the Hearn Generating Station is being proposed to be this new convention center to hold festivals and events and various things like that in it, which this thesis intends to connect to and work with. So this is the building proposal. So this is the Film Institute that starts to, it's in front of the Hearn Generating Station, and it starts to actually activate the water's edge and really make this a place that people will want to go to and want to experience. As well as you can see how this urban zone starts to connect with the more natural zone where there's lots of sailing and recreational type program in that more natural area. So I wanted to talk about, avert your attention to the boards here because it's bigger. So looking at this exploded axon of the building itself, with this being the footprint of the building and those being the various layers of how this is pulled apart, I wanted to go back to those qualities I talked about earlier and how they start to relate to the design of the building. So first is the narrative quality, which is really about the buildings themselves and how the buildings become the events or the things that people want to go to and experience. And then the spectator quality is really about the in-between zones, and it's this catwalk system, which you can see is highlighted in red in most of the drawings, is this catwalk system that the public is able to get up onto and actually start to be within this facility and being able to experience the filmmaking process. And then the optical quality is really about framing of spaces. So this was turned into the structural framing system for the canopy that's above the whole building, or most of the building. which really starts to frame the spaces as you're walking through them. And I'd like you to occasionally look at the television over there, the screen over there, that will, you'll see various spaces like this and how spaces are starting to be framed and framing pathways and various things throughout this structural frame. And then there's the temporal quality, which, like I said, is related to the change of time. And the change of time really relates to the light and shadow that's created within the spaces. And you'll see all the way on the end over here, this drawing, there's a direct light that actually starts to be, it shades the direct light, the canopy, from the south. And then on the north, it lets diffuse light into the space, which is much better for these film studios that are going to be being used. Specifically the backlots here, which are these more exterior courtyards that are used for filming as well. So I wanted to point out a couple case studies on the screen that led me to some of these choices. So the Le Francois, the National Studio for Contemporary Arts, also uses this catwalk system that weaves in between all the buildings and is in between the new and the old interventions. And this is an unbuilt project, but I found it very interesting. The Cultural Cinema Center actually deals with various programs and how they're actually connected together through the public circulation. You'll notice how that creates really interesting spaces like this, where there's a film set and people filming, and people are actually able to look down into the facility as a spectator. And then the last one is the Swedish Film Institute, which I fortunately was able to go see, thanks to last summer. And it's, this one really talks about the building as an object and how it could start to relate to these ideas of film as well. And then also plays around with various site moves where there's approaches and entries into the building. So this Film Institute is really about this play between the public and the private. And all in the red here is where all the public realm is around the site, but as well as the catwalk system, which allows people to get up onto this this place and really be integrated into this facility rather than being excluded from the film production program. As well as this opens up opportunities for open spaces and green spaces that also relate to the various different experiences you might have when you get here. And there was also considerable attention towards noise disturbances and how noise can affect where the program is. So for instance, in this diagram, all the gray is the sound stages. So you'll notice that they're in the back part of the building away from the water. So that's intentional to actually protect the sound stages from outside noises. So for instance, boats making noises, various things along the water as well. And you notice how the catwalk actually connects over into some future context that would be on the other side of the roads as well. So it includes a film school in this part up here where there's various classrooms and studio spaces for students to being able to design and develop films, and and then as well as the Innovation Center, which is right here, which is more like research labs related to film and how production studios can enhance their technologies in what they're creating. As well as the production studio at the end, which is it's more like a leased out space for productions that come in and lease out the spaces. So there's office spaces, various studio departments, art departments, all related to program of film, the film industry. And then, most importantly, is the public parts, which are these theaters, all located in this central axis right here, which includes an IMAX theater, as well as what I like to call a innovative tech box theater, which is more like a technologically advanced theater where there might be representations of virtual reality, various other ways to enhance this film experience. As well as this central portion is an access from the ferry dock, which was included, to create a new access or entry into the Hearn generating station for a lot of the events that would be happening here. Oh, and I forgot to say on this one is the catwalk actually connects right into the Hearn generating station. There's actually currently an art gallery up there right now, so people can connect right over to the Hearn and be part of that. So all the circulation within the building is actually interior and separate from the actual catwalk system. So you can actually get from one place to another without having to go outside. And there's I also wanted to point out the difference between the static spaces and the dynamic spaces. The static spaces are really about these frontmost buildings that are buildings more related to classrooms and offices that aren't so dynamic. Whereas the sound stages and the theaters and even the Hearn itself act as this program that changes over time. So this is a representation of what one of those sound stages could look like. So you see how this is a film set, people are filming, and this is something where this could be up for a couple months when they're filming, take down, put something new up, various things can be included. And you'll also notice that up here, highlighted in red, is what I like to call the spectate room, where it's actually connected to the catwalk system here. So you pass through it into the Hearn area, and you are able to look down into the spaces to view the filmmaking process. And then also the backlots, which are, like I said before, the central portions that are exterior, however they're covered with that canopy system. So you'll see the structural frames and the canopy system here, and how this can also be a flexible space to really put things into film and film sets. And you'll also see that the catwalk system is up here, up on that level above, where people are able to look down into the spaces and really experience it. So I'm going to leave you with this as we move. This is the aerial, and we're going to transition over into the animation, which will be on that screen. And I'm hoping that you're able to pick out some of the qualities that are within, that I previously talked about within the film, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, so with that, I'd like to conclude with this is a thesis that looks at the relationship between filmmaking and placemaking and how film can really be influenced to create places and spaces to go, as well as how the industry of film can actually start to inform the creation of spaces and places. So with that, I would like to open it up to any questions, concerns, worries, or fears. And as well as we're discussing, I also have models over there on the table that you're able to look at. So yeah, take a look at those too.
So Timothy, I have a quick question.
Yes.
So when I look at your long section,
Yeah.
You've created a repetitive structural frame that's very similar to a factory, and you put it in front of a factory,
Yeah.
right? So given your desire to kind of look at different ways to make film narrative frames time, did you think about just superimposing those diagrams on the existing building?
Yeah, so
Putting the film
I'll put
studio-
that out there right away. That was the first thing I thought of. I wanted to do an adaptive reuse project on the Hearn itself. However, I thought that the Hearn generating station was much more than what this program was, meant for. And I thought that using it to activate the water's edge and having it, be really related to the Hearn and use the Hearn as really a backdrop, because it's something historical significance, I think, was very important to this place. And the fact that the outdoor cinema has a screen on it that can have movies playing on it at night. But it can really, because the city has plans for that building, they're planning on doing things to it. And there's already film studio program that they already do that. They film in there as well. So that was one thing I forgot to mention too, because the Hearn is actually used for film production as well. Yeah. So that's what I kind of veered away from that, because I felt like there were better opportunities to go onto the water's edge and really create this thing as a whole, rather than just focusing on the Hearn. I mean, the Hearn was a thesis in itself, I'll be completely honest. So yeah.
Well, it seems like the railing janitor won on this one.
Lots of railings, yeah.
As with the structural one, I do like the way you've shown the tectonics of how all this thing fits together in your still images down at the bottom here that were on the screen, and in your movie, you show cables and turnbuckles and gusset plates, and you've made some design decisions there. Which I think is really nice. The one thing I'm kind of confused about is this whole thing is not climate enclosed, right? It's just got a roof on top of it. So isn't it cold in Toronto? Is this just a partial year facility?
So that was a big discussion. And so the building itself, the proposed institute, has all interior circulation. So whoever's working there, the people who are working there are in climate controlled areas. So I didn't want to be afraid to put the people of the public, who it's Toronto, who they they know the cold, if they want to go up and experience this, I didn't want to be afraid of the weather, in a sense, and just enclose this thing and make it into a huge bubble that there was a climate within. However, it's protected by the weather and various things like that. So that was my thought, because I tried hard to make the building all enclosed, and you can get from place to place without having to go outside. However, the people of the public who are out on these catwalks are experiencing that weather, which personally I think is related to the temporal quality and that awareness of what time of year it is, which also relates to that vegetation idea as well.
So I'm just going to add to that. Do you know Jean Nouvel's new Louvre in Abu Dhabi?
Yes.
That has this sort of overall encompassing roof, and has these small pavilions.
Yeah.
And it goes to the question of temporality and the weather.
Yeah.
I happened to be visiting that building this past July, and I almost passed out.
Hot?
Because it was so hot.
Yeah.
It was incredibly hot with this metal roof. Great design. He's my favorite architect. However, As soon as I stepped through the threshold, I regretted being there. I was like, I need to go back. And this leads to my other question, because the individual pavilions that leads you to the art exhibit sequentially. But once you enter, you can't bail out. You can't escape and go into the courtyard. You have to go all the way to the end of the sequence before you can find the restaurant, which is quote unquote your reward. And because as soon as I literally got midway, I was feeling sick, and I asked the guard, how can I get up? You can't get to the courtyard. You got to go all the way up. So you finished, as soon as I got to the end, I ran back out and got a taxi and left. So it goes back to this question. You can't ignore, especially in Toronto, because you're not only building this for people that live in Toronto, you're building a global franchise that's going to bring people from all over the globe, people from Hawaii or whatever that wants to see this. So that aspect of conditioning the space, especially for tourists, not giving them a reprieve from the element, I think it's something that you shouldn't take for granted and think, oh yeah, people will get used to it because they know they're there. My second point is, how as a daily person, and I was hoping your animation was going to show that because it showed the point of arrival. How as a tourist am I moving through this? I climb those stairs and start the journey, and I start seeing these respective studios as I'm going down. How do I end my journey? Do I have to come all the way back? Or do I go through that other road that has the bridge open? Is that my way out of the complex?
So you can look at it a couple ways. The building design, is all about this sequence of frames as you go through. So yeah, you can start here and go all the way through, and that's your sequence if that's the way you want to choose to go. However, you can go on these catwalks and you could go all the way. I can't point at it. You can go out. This is dying. So if you go out, you can actually go out into here and then get back down, or you can go this way and go here and go to a stair down, and go out here or out here and then there, and then work your way down.
So you're always walking. Are you always walking your way back to the entry point to leave the site?
So I think it's up to the person and their experience.
No, but you're the creator. How do you expect people to move through the site?
I expect them to make, choices. I think that even though I have a series of events, and I think that this is being able to come through this site and actually coming through.
So that
around.
that's the loop I was looking at.
Yeah.
Like how you sort of.
So if there was a common way to go through it, I would like I guess the real sequence of events, the path that you would choose. Then yeah, I would say you would come up through here, you would walk through, and then come out to the other side as well.
And here's the reason I'm asking, because whenever you create this sequential journey, you always have to create a reward at the end. It's the same thing if you're doing retail and you're building a retail mall, you create an anchor at the end to draw people all the way to the end. Otherwise, those stores before you get to the anchor will die. Nobody will lease them because nobody's going to go there. So if you're creating this narrative, again, you talk about movie, you always have a payback at the end of a movie, right? Otherwise, there's no point in sitting through 2 hours, right? There's always something at the end of it that's going to draw you through. Enjoy those different experiences, and then you get the reward at the end, and then you can go home. You can choose to bail out midway, but if you're building this sequential catwalk as this sort of spine that ties everything together, I would expect some element, and mostly people use food as a driver. Like for example, at the Louvre, they put the cafeteria all the way at the end because they know you're going to need water by the time you're done running through this labyrinth. So again, that's one thing I was hoping to see. The other thing I was also hoping to see is a temporal aspect in your animation. You mentioned the temporal quality that you draw from film. The only temporal aspect I saw is actually the physicality of me moving through the space. I was hoping, as you show in this animation, you can see the sun sort of going across and just casting different shadows.
I tried to do that in the end where the sun kind of goes down.
That's a very important part of your story.
I appreciate the comments about the cold weather, but I think they say something like there's no bad weather or no bad gear. I think that you did a decent job of kind of protecting those interior spaces with the enclosed spaces along the edges. So you've got the studio classroom buildings to the south that are going to block a little bit of wind, right? And then you've got the sound stages that are enclosed to the north. Am I reading that right? So it's sort of protecting that central space a little bit, at least from the wind.
Well, so the north is actually this way.
Ah, gotcha. Okay. Well, again, along the water, you're protecting from some of those breezes. I'm really fascinated by your use of the catwalks here, and I really like how they're sort of threading through these frames. And I appreciate your diagrams here, the exploded axons. I like the frames, the kind of wider frames and how they're articulated differently as they move down the site. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the thinner frames that you've set up. They seem
on here?
much more static
These?
in comparison. Yeah.
So you're saying from these to these?
Yeah.
So that was due to the one slide I had about the immense versus the intimate spaces. So that was to try to create spaces that in frames seemed really large, but then when you turn the corner, then all of a sudden you're in these frame spaces that are much tight knit. And then when you go out, like you saw in the animation, out into one of these, you just open out right into the landscape and maybe take a picture.
I wonder if there's some opportunity for some differentiation there. Maybe they like grow and shrink as you walk along that path, or maybe there's a color difference. It seems very the same, and maybe the idea is that the light is playing differently, and that's the thing that's changing. But that's a really interesting piece of the project to me. I think there's opportunity there.
I'm intrigued by this, and I agree that the catwalks are one of the most satisfying aspects of it. I find the frames, the kind of marching frames, and the fact that it ended up appearing like it was an industrial building, kind of like superimposed next to an industrial building, I find that a little bit awkward. And what's interesting is sometimes you're using the frames as a tool, like you would use it in a creation of a film, and like when the film is done, like some of those frames, oftentimes those frames are kind of pulled away, and like it becomes a sequential thing that you don't need them. So they're really so I think that perhaps you could have been a little less dogmatic about them in the end. Like they were there for a reason, and maybe sometimes they could be absorbed into the building, and sometimes they could be, or even just like, could the roofs over the courtyards be operable and openable to let the sun in and things like that. I just find it's kind of overpowering, and I wish that even formally, I wish they weren't so industrial. Because I think the building form underneath of it is actually quite interesting in the relation to the catwalks, and maybe there's a little bit more fluidity in the way you handle them. I don't know.
It's 20 degrees inside the catwalk where it goes through inside. Humidify the inside a little bit for comfort, because you're not ready for station.
I ran across Nicholas Pevner's building types in a used bookstore the other day, and sort of musing about what an old-fashioned idea of building types is, particularly as interpreted by him, because they were essentially historic types. What's intriguing about your building is I don't understand how to make movies, so it's a great mystery. It's magic, just magic. And it's so much harder. I love the Academy Awards because it is so hard to make something. Reality as convincing as they do, which is only temporary. Which leads us to that illustration, which says, well, yeah, we could make that into a setting that looks like a suburban Toronto when, because of the snow, we can't do that.
Yeah.
But you could do anything in this building. You really could. I'm reminded of the Berlin Free University more than anything.
Yeah.
Which is the idea of a matrix into which you could put a whole world of activities. And since it's not too tall sectionally, you could put housing on top. I mean, it's really a universal infrastructure for building that you're suggesting here. And I'll trust you that it's good for movies.
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah.
What was the precedent you just said?
I'm sorry?
The Berlin precedent.
Oh, the Berlin Free University.
It's a big grid.
This disappeared from the cabinet.
Yeah, that's very well.
Usage, Candiles, and Woods. No recognition. By the way.
30 feet.
So I'm trying very hard to find something negative to say about this project, but I can't. I really can't. The last time I was here for juries, it was a number of years ago. I got back to the office and somebody who works for me came in a few days later and said, "Do you know what you're being called out there?" I said, "Stephen, I am not abused." But I honestly can't find anything bad to say about this project. I totally agree with you that there is a relationship between film and architecture. I think any architect, if they look at the films that they most like, although you didn't include mine, which is Fellini's Avatar.
I'll put that in next time.
There is a definite relationship to what you like in the movie and what you appreciate in the building. It's absolutely there. My major complaint about architects today is that I think they fall into two categories. There are architects and firms that make nice urban designs and pretty crappy buildings. And there are people who make nice buildings in themselves but don't understand urban design. And I think this project does both of them really well. I think the first move you made that I totally agree with is not touching the generating station. There's a building in Georgetown, the Southwest Heating Plant, that David Ajay is attempting to turn into condominiums. And there's been an ongoing debate about how much they should rework that building. And I think this move of not touching it, the building next to it, when I first saw, if you back away from it, which drawing, that one up there, when I first saw that one, I thought you were making an addition to that building. That's the way it reads.
Yeah, I mean, it attaches with the catwalks.
Right, but I thought it's a very clever addition to that building. It takes what is a monumental but pretty deadening facade and builds a lower facade in front of it that activates that building. That was a very, very clever move. And I realized, no, you're not touching, except for the catwalks.
Yeah.
You're building across the street, across that alley, whatever it is, and giving it a presence on the waterfront, a new facade. It's a really, really good move. The graphics are beautiful.
Thank you.
Did you paint the wheels on the...
Yes.
Just ask, did you paint them red?
Yeah.
But it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, all the drawings. I love the way these drawings are slightly abstracted. You're not trying to make it look like exactly what it's going to be. There are these red ghosts running around everywhere. And the video at the end, yeah, we can talk about maybe the sun didn't set it exactly right. It's just really, really nicely done. Good project.
Well, I started with the same comment about the ghost images, which I really appreciate renderings that look like somebody drew them, not someone took a picture of them. And I think, to me, this is a project, I'm looking at it as something that's built. You know, you brought the detail into this thing all the way down to the end. What I would say my challenge would be to you is to make some memorable, beyond the catwalks, maybe the forms of the theaters, make something memorable that takes this out of this historic realm that will make me say, that's a great building. It could be a rolling roof form, it could be pieces coming out of it. I mean, Jackson Pollock, he could paint Impressionist art like anybody, but he went further. And so, and what he did, made history, and I think you can take the next step and just sort of put it down, put some trace down, and then just go crazy. Break the rules that you made.
Okay. Thank you.
For me, I've been concentrating on the ground floor plan, and you seem to have not sort of brought anything to the public realm that would activate it as far as people moving through the site that are not involved with filmmaking, just people that are... Is there a reason why you didn't have more retail on the channel and also retail in the Turbine Hall, sort of responding to what they said?
Yeah, so this is intended to be not so much this one and this one, but these ones, the exhibit spaces and the shops and this cafe, I felt would have that feeling of retail spaces, and it doesn't have to be necessarily like a store. I thought maybe the exhibition spaces could, if someone's interested in coming into the film program or this film institute, and there's an exhibit on film, that they could come in and it'd be like a museum space that would be able to be used. But yeah, if I would redo this, I would try to, have this be more activated with program, as well as I did it here because of the Hearn generating station, and trying to activate maybe this spot a little bit more with retail too.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
everything about this project is very internal, because basically they want the studio spaces to be black box, so they control everything. And so you could have lined, at least at the ground floor, line that with retail, and then the public could also come, to experience this. Because it is a great setting. You're there at the channel. It's not unlike the new wharf here in DC. So you could have had that here in addition to what you're doing with filmmaking facilities themselves. So that's everything else. I agree with what people said earlier. It's just that I just saw it as a missed opportunity, and I was wondering why you didn't do that, because it just seems like a no-brainer. You got the green, you got the boardwalk, you got the water.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Okay, so.
It's one of those things that was when I first initially was laying out the program. Retail as it relates to like the street and the urban environment wasn't in the program originally. So when this started to slowly turn into like an urban project, I think it was a little bit left out, but that's okay. I definitely agree with that.
So I have a question about the closed sets.
Yeah.
On the back, those two images that you have on top.
Yeah, so this is the interior one, this is the exterior open air one in the middles.
Do they normally allow people to watch the film process in terms of
Good question.
shutting things down and people recording stuff and leaking it?
So
how don't they control access to what people can see?
So it's up to the production themselves if they want to have people. I mean, they film in streets a lot, and people are like along the sides, and they're looking and watching, see what's happening. However, I'm making it a point to. It was discussed, and we thought that specifically in these ones or these sound stages. That these windows could actually be shut off, so they could block the views in if they absolutely, because security would be an issue with that, especially if there's another famous actor in one of these spaces who might not want pictures taken of them while they're doing things. So it could be closed if they wanted when they're actually filming, but yeah.
So the last point I was going to make is. People were mentioning that you didn't engage the historic warehouse, which I agree is a great move, not touching it. However, you started by making what I call these in-between spaces. For example, the spaces between the theaters, which the mezzanine sort of inhabits, which in a sense become, if they gain their own sense of self themselves. And I wonder if that major in-between space between the old and the new, if there is an active strategy for that, as opposed to just a gap between that building and this building and a road runs through.
Yeah.
I keep looking for an image of it here.
Yeah,
that's image. Yeah. And I wonder if there is just a real strong attitude, as you've sort of shown in your project, towards that in-between space. Because that is the main in-between space between the old and the new. Yeah. What happens there? How do people move through it? How do people inhabit it? What program goes in there? As opposed to swinging everything to your side. Because I love the in-between spaces that you're making under this canopy of a roof. That lateral step next door, I wonder if did you think about that or?
So this space specifically.
So it's not like an alley.
Yeah. So originally it was a service road because it would have to access and get.
I see loaded up.
Yeah, so loading docks and trucks would being able to go back into there, and that would be how the trucks would be able to go back. However, I don't want to look at it as a service road. Okay. However, that's why I added some of the retail program into the Hearn that would start to enliven that. But I think the point about putting retail along this edge would help solve that issue of how people experience that a little bit better.
And people can move on the ground floor through those blocks.
Where?
Through those blocks. They can
here?
Move, yeah, they can move.
Not from here, because these are just the sound stages. So when you're in the sound stages, the main axes are this way, and you can exit here on this side and this side. Because this is the sound stage, so they wanted to be no doors or anything, especially on the street.
Tim, I think the presentation you did was
really quite extraordinary, which is very professionally done. I think the film that you did was revealing. It tended to frame to me the presence of system and the kind of mechanical, repetitive nature of things. Somebody said, I think you said something about railings. There's somebody, the gender for railings is going to be very happy here. There's a lot of railings to clean here. But there's a system that you've set up. And what I don't see enough of is the event in contrast to that. I don't see enough of, I think the next pass on this would be to focus and try to figure out how that big grand space that's roughly in the center, slightly to the right of center. I always never like to be in the right of center. But,
Yeah, this is a very symmetrical but not symmetrical building.
But if you're looking outward, it's to the left of center. You're right. It's a space I think it needs a lot of TLC at the moment. It's a kind of placeholder for an idea, and what really revealed that to me is that each of those vignettes that you did on this screen ended with a little click. And I was kind of imagining that we were going to arrive someplace. We were always in the process of going somewhere, but we never really arrived in any of those events. So if I were to redo that video, I would arrive on a soundstage, and I'd see people on the soundstage, and I'd understand that the soundstage is a space that's generic, like the space that we're in at the moment, that can be adapted to anything. But this central, the big stage that's in the middle, the piazza that you made, the piazza, the San Marco kind of space. That space really needs to have some thought in terms of its edges and its center, and, what its qualities are as figure in contrast to the repetitive system. Yeah. And I use that example of Venice because Venice is a lot of system that builds up one of the best figures of space that you'll ever find any place on Earth. So it might be something to look at because there's a relationship to water and promenade and water edge and so forth.
That's why people take pride in it. Don't you think that the things that they build and then you remove and then take down and then those extra become the events in this building?
He's talking about the outdoor. No, I'm talking about central.
I don't think it has. I don't think it has
a good, flexible outdoor space to see out there.
Well, I would think as an urban designer, just like you, I would think somebody needs to design that space. I find it to be very diagrammatic.
I think some of the spaces that we see earlier today are broken up into too many parts. They're just allowing us to be able to receive things.
Well, I just said the Piazzetta San Marco. I'm not saying which is a big space, or the Piazzale and the Piazza. They're big spaces. I'm just saying there has to be this space is already starting to break up with the planting of the trees and the bumpy edges around the edges of it. I think that what I'm seeing, again, is this notion of movement and system, and I'm not seeing the space making that complements it. And I agree, these other spaces are big stage spaces.
And your architecture has already set it.
I thought you were done. Here you go.
So, to Brian's point, your architecture is already saying that. You actually decided to break the roof away by making a statement there.
Yeah.
So, and you decided to sort of make the screen at the terminus of the cross axis. So it is a space that you kind of can't ignore. It's not a leftover space. To me, I see that as like the concert is happening at like 6 p.m. on a nice Friday night. That's where everybody's doing wine and cheese, and you take the pictures and like all that stuff after you've done your tours. So you can't ignore like a major central. It's dead smack in the middle of your project. So to Brian's point, I think just in the next pass, just take a look at it.
We need time.
Actually, they do make foam cubes that you can put microphones in that you toss across a room. They're really cool. I'm going to make that up. So I started off by congratulating you on your tectonics and the detail of your various systems and parts, your railings, etc. If I were you and I was to revisit this or take it further, continue with it, I think what's lacking is you have a system, but you don't have the architecture yet. That this is a filmmaking village under a big tent, and you've designed the tent, and you've designed the catwalks for the tent, but except for a view somewhere, like here, you're showing that these are clearly panelized, and there was, in your movie, I guess some of these have little vaults in the corners, which I think was nice, but, you know, what's happening here? That looks like a cartoon of a storefront, not a storefront. Is this space inside or outside, and is that really the right thing? I actually think that you should color code your buildings. It would make it more interesting than if they're all gray. To somehow make this as a series of little buildings that have architecture to themselves covered by your big tent would make it a more interesting project. So if you're to revisit it when you turn my age, you can pull out the computer file if the files are still relevant and work on it in your retirement.
You know suburban houses pretty well.
Yeah, I'm ready. They got porches, you talk to the neighbors, you know, it works.
Just to wrap it up, Tim.
That's exactly what I said.
Yeah. Tim, I don't know if you noticed, this is probably the largest building ever built. I think you kind of picked a very large site, and I loved how the way you engage within the site. I think you developed, first of all, he's a very smart guy, and we all know that. He developed a system for himself and a language, a vocabulary language, and a set of rules for himself. So he was able to build upon those rules as they actually develop from milestone to milestone. Your quality of the graphics, I admit they're quite beautiful. I mean, they're very lovely. I agree with Brian on this. And the quality of the spaces, kind of looking at the magic behind, you're talking about the magic of cinema, like for you it's magic, and it is. It's kind of like in The Wizard of Oz, peeling off the curtain so we can see inside the space, and I love that. There's a moment for the tourists to understand how film is actually made, which, you know what, for everybody, I think whether you're old or young, it's fascinating to see that. And you capture that, you bring that to life. I have to say, we're going to wrap it up, but it's been a true pleasure having this guy as a student. I love his discussions with him regarding theory and architecture and film overall. We both love cinema a lot. And I'm going to miss you a lot next semester, man.
Great.
Good luck
Thank
in
you
your
so
future,
much.
man. All right?
Everybody to take his or her seat to the other side for the next review.